22, verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on this boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all the nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. That seems a little odd to me. Does it seem a little odd to you? Where do we have anywhere in the scripture where somebody's supposed to kill another human for a sacrifice to Jehovah God? That's like the pagan stuff. The pagan stuff we hear about all the time. That's not what we hear about for Jehovah God. What an unusual thing, isn't it? Sort of.
And then we have the whole thing about the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, and then now he's got his only son.
Isn't that odd? Let me give you another oddity. We read it in chapter 21. Chapter 20 in verse 7. Ready? "Now return the man's wife," God is talking to Abimelech in a dream. He says, "Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet." Abraham is a prophet? Since when? What has Abraham ever done in his life that was about him telling from God to the people something about God? I mean, we've had a lot of stories about Abraham. Have we ever had him beat a prophet? Not until this chapter. This is the chapter that identifies Abraham as a prophet. Remember when Ezekiel or John or Daniel or any of those guys, when they had prophecy, the prophecy they got was different than the rest of the text. Do you remember that? It was like they got a vision, or like in Ezekiel's case, he would lay on the ground and throw rocks at a pretend, he was the weird one, right? The weird prophet. And he was always doing odd little demonstrations. Remember when he had to lay on one side for so many months and then lay on the other side for so many months and then throw rocks at it? He had to dig a hole. He did all these things that God told him to do, and they were messages from God about what was going to happen coming up. The messages that God gave Isaiah and Daniel were so shocking to them that Daniel especially, in one place it says he didn't eat for 3 weeks. He was so shook up by what he saw. He saw these visions. They tried to tell us what they saw. They tried to describe it. Remember, we looked at the way they told, and you could see they were telling in different ways the same events. Remember that those events occurred currently and then also in the future. Do you remember that? We talked about the sign of a true prophet is that what they say comes true. So when we see a thing that's a vision for the future, it usually comes true also at that time. So think about this. This is happening now for Abraham with his son. Why does God make sure and slip in there his only son? Abraham had another son, but there was only one son of promise. What does this sound like? Who carried the wood? Jesus carried the cross on his back. Who carried the wood in the story? The son, Isaac, right? Did he go willingly? Do we see here that Isaac punched his dad in the nose and said, "Get away from me, you old man"? No. And Isaac was no baby. The chapter before, he was weaned. And in the next chapter, Sarah dies. She's 127 when she dies. So somewhere between the age of weaning and 37 years old is where Isaac is. So if you want to say he's in his 20s, he had to be a fairly good-sized lad, or, old, because he carried the wood up the mountain. The donkey carried the wood to the mountain, and then the boy carried the wood up to the mountain.
It doesn't say, though, how Isaac responded when his dad bound him and put him
It
on
doesn't say lots of stuff. Lots of stuff is not said here.
Right.
Not like in chapter 21. Wait till you read chapter 23 when they start bartering over Sarah's grave thing. Then there's all kinds of details. So-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, and they went back and forth. And yet here, on this momentous thing, we get this kind of streamlined version where you're left trying to fill the gaps for it. But that is just like prophecy, is it not? Prophecy often has a lot of, especially when it's applied to the future, a lot of like things that are not quite so detailed. Certain details and others not detailed. I would submit to you that this chapter is what makes Abraham a prophet. When this event occurred, Abraham was just doing what God told him to do, just like all the other prophets did. And what ended up happening is this event became what makes Abraham a prophet. Go ahead.
I just noticed this when you were reading, and I was really listening. At the end of verse 5, he says, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we will come back to you."
Thank you. Now hold that spot. Perfect. Go to Hebrews chapter 11. If Abraham was planning to actually kill Isaac, sacrifice him, then why did he say, "We'll be back"? Look at Hebrews chapter 11. It's going to answer there for us. Starting at verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offerings will be reckoned, that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Okay, now let's be us, okay? You're hanging around. You've had God talk to you 6 times. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know that, well, I think there's one time that God spoke to me that I remember something specific that happened. I don't know how old, 8 or 9, and I was sitting in the pew at the Buckeye Christian Church, and it came time for the invitation, and I was thinking I should probably go up and do this because I'm ready for this. I don't know how old, maybe I was 6. I don't know. I was very young. And I felt a push. Like I felt a prompting to get up. I would say that's the closest I've come to feeling like God actually spoke to me. Abraham has had God speak directly to him 6 times. He's given specific promises, even that he's come to see him. He's seen him, like he looked like an angel, and then they identified that it was Yahweh, right? He's 6 times. And this time, all we get is this part. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am. Yep, what you need, God? Huh? Here I am. Did he come in person? Was it a voice out of heaven? Was it a light? What was it? We don't know. All we know is that Abraham, God said, Abraham, he said, right here. Then God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. And it's all we hear. Do you think there was any other conversation? I have no idea. It's very brief. It's like summative in nature. It's not the kind of detail we saw in any of the other sections. It sounds like God said, like he just said, yep, right here. And then we go on. And then what's this in this first verse? Sometime later, God tested Abraham. I thought the scripture said that God would not tempt us. Come on, somebody correct it. What I say wrong? What's the difference between being tempted and being tested? By the way, James 1:13 says that God will not tempt us. What's the difference between tempt and test?
Doesn't tempt to me has more of a connotation of sin, tempting us to sin, or where we could make a difference between to sin or not to sin. God will never lead us in the direction where we could choose sin.
Yes, but I can certainly see a fine line because all the words you just described could be applied to this issue with Isaac. I mean, certainly that would not have been a right thing to kill Isaac, and yet God told him to kill him, right? So in the midst...
He also was saying from the very beginning, Abraham was, that and tells Isaac, God will provide. He had no doubt that God was going to provide the animal.
Here's a funny thing in that part, right where you were at, verse 8. Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. That sentence is purposely, they have a fancy grammar name for it, if anybody's a grammar person. Carolyn is, she likes that kind of thing. It's called, is it vocative or appositive? Yeah, let me give you another sentence. Feed the lion, Fred, or feed the lion, Fred.
Depends on where you put the comma.
Okay, look back at it. That comma is not there in the original translation, it's just the straight words. Look back at that sentence in verse 8. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Do you see it? It's almost like Abraham is hinting that his son is the one that God is providing. Remember, this is like prophecy. This is more like prophecy than it is like the narrative we've seen before, where there's a lot of blanks in here. But you can see how this is tending toward an example of what's going to happen in Christ when Christ comes, right? It's giving us an image of what's going to happen with Christ. Christ went willingly. Christ bore the wood on his back. Christ was the son that was provided, right? All of that is kind of giving us a precursor to what we see happens with Christ. Interesting, huh? Okay, I don't know though. If I was Abraham, would you have slept that night? I'd be going, that face right there, that's the face I'd be making. She made this face where she goes, no. Like, I would be concerned because it doesn't fit. In fact, I don't think I would have done this. I don't think I could have had that amount of faith.
But that's why he's in the Hall of Fame.
There we go.
And we're not.
There we go. I would have had a hard time doing this just because it is so not God. There were pagan religions in the area that did practice sacrifice like that, but not Jehovah. This was not Jehovah's shtick. So this was really an odd thing to be asked. But Abraham, all he knows is what he knows. He doesn't know about Christ. He doesn't know about the Messiah. None of that has happened yet. And yet this scripture, which was written in this text just as it is, was already written 1,500, 2,000 years before Christ ever came on the scene. It was in written form. It started in oral form, and then they wrote it down. So it was written. So it's been written a long time before Christ ever came. Don't you think the other Jewish people who read this were doing the same thing? Don't you think they're going, what in the world? Then all of a sudden, when the Messiah comes and they start, look at that, look at how that is the same. And that's why we see in the New Testament authors, many of them pointing to this story as the image of what was going to happen with the Messiah, as the prophecy of what's going to happen. So it's kind of fun that way. Not if you're Abraham, though. Oh my goodness. Also, somebody mentioned, how come they said, this seems wrong. It seems to be an error because it says your only son. Why would God say, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love? Why is that your son, the only son? That's not his only son.
Was the other one not born yet?
There was Ishmael,
Yeah, Ishmael, okay.
and Ishmael was older.
Oh,
You know, he was blessing the story through.
This was the son of promise. This was the son that God said you were going to have. Ishmael, and what happened with the other, what's her name? Hagar. What happened with Hagar and Ishmael? That was Abraham and Sarah's plan because Sarah hadn't had a son yet. And how many times did God have to protect this situation so that he wouldn't have remember, because he kept passing off his wife as his sister. And so every time he'd get in those situations, God would come in and miraculously do things, like last week when he stopped up their works. they couldn't do the deed. And the whole Abimelech and his whole family could not do the deed. That happened at least twice that we know of in regard to Abraham, because God was protecting the seed of for Isaac. Okay. So this term tested and tempted. When you test something, you're checking it for something, right? That's why in the English translation they're using the word tested, because that means similar to what the Hebrew word means. It's checking it. You're checking the strength of it, right? If I test it, I'm checking to see how strong it is. Is this going to hold my Bible? Is it strong enough? Yeah, I'm testing it. What do I do to test it? I kind of push it, try to bend it a little, see if it's going to hold, right? I'm testing it. God does do that. He does it all the time. In fact, he's created us so that the testing makes us stronger. How do you get a muscle? Do you go, grow, muscle, grow?
I don't think I've tried that.
No, it doesn't work. I think like this. Muscle, come thou forth. What do you do to get that muscle to grow? You use a weight, you exercise it, and then when you exercise it, the muscle gradually becomes stronger and stronger. That's testing it. I'm testing that muscle. That's another way of saying it. I'm testing that muscle. I'm making it grow and get stronger and stronger. And who needs to know that it's stronger? If I think that I am not strong enough to lift this music stand, guess what? I'm not. If in my mind I don't believe I can, I won't be able to. Part of the reason we can do things is because we've done them in part or in some form, and that gives us the confidence to actually apply that pressure that's going to require to lift that up. That's testing. I'm testing I could do this, so maybe I can do that. I can do this, so maybe I can do that. And we get stronger and stronger that way. And you and I, during our whole faith walk in Christ are being tested in the sense of strengthened. Tested in the sense of offered opportunities that are a little bit of a stretch, a little bit more than what we've done before, a little deeper knowledge, a question we haven't really asked or pondered before, things that we've skipped over sometimes because we were too young to even recognize that it was an issue. And then as we mature and get old in our faith and in our walk, all of a sudden we're asking different questions and coming to different knowledge on things that we never thought of before. That's testing. God is testing your faith. What happens when you fail?
You have to repent.
Yeah, you especially if it's sin, right? But the test could be that God had a role for you to play in a situation and you didn't step up to the role. So is that really sin? Well, sort of, because you're not doing what God has created you to do. But it's even more just your own need for maturity and growth that you can do that. So then what does God do as the master of the universe? We weren't able to pass that test he gave us. So then what does he do? Give up on us? He gives us something a little less. So if I try to lift up this stand and I can't do it, then I go lift up the book. I can lift up the book. So then I lift up the book a bunch of times, and pretty soon I can lift up the stand, right? We back up to what we can do. But how does God know? Or I don't really think it's about God knowing. I think it's more about us knowing. How do we know that we can? When do we believe that we can? Remember when the disciples came back to Jesus and said, "You're not going to believe it. Whenever we cast out the demons, they just run away like they're not supposed to be in there. Even the demons are listening to us." Oh, he's going to ask for the count. I think I had 8 this morning. Thanks. So, they were even surprised that was happening. Even the demons listened to us. Like, guess what? So that's this kind of testing. It's to see where's Abraham's faith. God never intended for Abraham to kill Isaac. He wanted to see if Abraham would give the best of what he's had. Was he willing to give all and the best of what he has? All of the book of Malachi is about offering to the Lord your best. What about Cain and Abel? Giving of your best, the best of what you have to offer. Well, how do you know what your best is if you're not tested? We're tested and tried, and that helps us to know what's best. How do you know that gold is pure?
Heat it up.
You put it in the fire, right? You put it in the fire. What happens when you put the metal in the fire?
If there's any impurities, they rise to the top.
They rise to the top and or burn out even. So when you heat the metal, it actually makes it more pure because some impurities actually burn out of it. Other impurities rise to the top that you can take off at the top. So then you have a more pure metal. That's gold. That same word is what you would use for this word for testing. That's testing, purifying, heating up and burning out. The burning out part is a little bit of a hardship. In real life, burning out's a bit of a hardship. Okay, ready for more? Oh, here's a cool thing right here. Look at this. He says here, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. So not only is Isaac the son of promise, the only one, but he is close to Abraham's heart, the one that you love. And go to the region of Moriah. Anybody know where Moriah is? I'll show Carolyn right there. Sorry, I'm trying to get Carolyn there. Okay, so he was over here in Hebron, which is like up in here is Hebron, right? And then he moved out this way towards Beersheba. Down here was where Sodom and Gomorrah was. And he moved away from Sodom and Gomorrah over here into Beersheba, out into the desert. He actually moved down in here and then back up to Beersheba. So right now he's in Beersheba. So Mount Moriah, the mountain range of Moriah is this whole area. And Mount Moriah is specifically in this area, which ends up being Jerusalem. It's not Jerusalem now. This is before there was Jerusalem. Okay? So where does God send him to make the sacrifice? To the same place Christ was sacrificed. This Mount Moriah area here, I'm going to show you another map. Let me first, here it is. Then this ends up being the Temple Mount. When Solomon builds the Temple Mount, this is where Christ was crucified. This is all in Jerusalem. Here's the Mount of Olives, the temple area. Here's where Christ was crucified. This is believed, they believe that this is where Abraham offered Isaac. And they built the Dome of the Rock. The Muslims built the Dome of the Rock right on top of that. That was considered the sacred place. Solomon chose this as a sacred place, and he placed the Holy of Holies right there. This was where they all visioned the Messiah, the prophecies of the Messiah. So Abraham then is making this prophecy not only in terms of Christ the Son, the view of that coming later, but also the place. This is the place. Before it was a place, when all it was a bunch of mountain hills like out here. And someone in our earlier class said, well, why did he bring the wood with him? Why did he just go there and then chop the wood? Well, the land is like our land. So if you knew you were going to go over to those hills right over there, and you knew you had to make a fire for a sacrifice, are you going to go and then plan to find the wood there? Good luck with that. There may or may not be any wood there, right? So if you're planning for that, you bring the wood with you on a donkey. Okay, so that's Mount Moriah. Notice here on verse 3, early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering. Why is Abraham cutting that wood? Why is Abraham cutting his own wood in the first place? He's got 2 servants and a son ready to go. But he's out splitting the wood. Now, don't you think that makes a scene for them? They're all going, oh, did you see Dad? He seems to be uptight.
Yeah.
He's cutting the wood himself. Can you imagine the mood associated with that? What is that? Tension? You said you want me to do this? Okay, I'm going to do this. I'll do this. And he's out there chopping the wood. He puts the wood on a donkey. He got his 2 servants, and he set out toward Mount Moriah on the 3rd day. So it took from overnight for him to get the wood. He got the vision during the night before. The next day he gets loaded up, so that's a day. And then it takes him 3 days to get to Mount Moriah. This did not happen overnight. It wasn't like this. It took 3 days of traveling to get to where they're going to offer the sacrifice.
What were the serpents for?
I don't know, because he left them at the base, and then he had, stay here with the donkey while I go, and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. Isn't that unusual too? Why did he have his son carry the wood? But see, all these things become the details that make it the prophecy for the future. Go ahead.
If God tells me to do this, then it's like, you want me to do this, then I will cut it. Because that is what you command me to do. I will cut it. Not my servants, I will do it.
There you go.
And that my son, he is the burden. He is going to carry the burden.
Oh,
That is
I
my
don't know
son.
if I had got along with your train of thought. I would have thought Abraham would have took the wood up, maybe even brought the donkey with him. But you're right, yeah. Who knows? We don't know
We're
any
all
of that.
speculating, which
We
gets
don't
you in
know.
trouble all the time.
Yeah, we don't know any of that. But that's kind of my point. Is there's all kinds of stuff around here that we don't know. Why did God make sure that we don't know all of that? Because God has certain details that he wanted us to see 2,000 years after the event happened. And those events, those are the key pieces. All those key pieces are there for us to see that Isaac, the one who was going to die, carried the wood, and our Christ carried the wood of his cross. Now, at the time, I don't know that Abraham had any idea any of those things mattered. But what's interesting to me is that God makes sure that those are the pieces of the story that we get recorded for us so much earlier than the event of Christ's death.
If we knew every detail, we would be so overwhelmed that I think my head would explode.
I think that should be called the Daniel diet. Because he like had 3 weeks he didn't eat after one of the visions.
And in my version, it says Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. Well, I don't have Isaac carrying the
Well, that is
On his son.
wood.
to carry it.
Wood on his son.
Uh-huh, yes.
It says,
Something
and
Isaac
he
picked up.
himself carried the fire and the knife. So Abraham took the fire and the knife, and Isaac carried the wood.
Okay.
Yeah, just read it again. It does say that.
Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac.
Yeah, the son, they're not to the place of the sacrifice yet. They've got to walk to it still. I think you're thinking they're already at the place, and Isaac's laying down or something, and he puts the wood on him. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, I'm just following,
That's what it says.
that's what it says here.
No, okay, let's back up.
You're ahead.
Back up to verse 4. Back up to verse 4. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." So in order to go over there, Abraham takes the wood off the donkey for the offering and puts it on Isaac to carry over there.
But the verse after he said, it's written that we'll come back to you, that's when it says Abraham took the wood. So Abraham's taking the wood, not Isaac.
Now keep going though. Took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac.
Carry the fire.
And he's saying he took the fire and the knife.
So Abraham carried the fire and the knife, and Isaac carried the wood. And it says, as the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, "Abraham, father." So then we go from there. Okay?
Okay.
Now that though, Eve, let's consider that a moment. Isaac is the picture of Christ. Who's Abraham the picture of? The Father.
I didn't want to say that.
He's the picture of the Father, right? And who's the Father is God. So he's the picture of God. So why does the Father carrying the knife and the fire? Because this is happening by God's will, not by someone else. God the Father allowed his son to be killed. He carried the knife and the fire. In other words, it was in God's control that this sacrifice be made. It didn't happen outside of his control. It wasn't like it happened and he couldn't do anything about it. Do you see what I mean? It's really showing that the Father was in charge of this. The fire and the wood are here, and then Abraham answered him, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. Now, just a minute. He bound his son Isaac. How old do we think Isaac is? Take your guess. What do you say? 20s? We'll say 20s? Okay. He was old enough to carry the wood, which would have been a lot of wood for killing a person, for burning a person, right? So a lot of wood. So he carried a lot of wood, so he wasn't like a little kid. Okay? He carried the wood, heavy load. So say 20. You don't think he could have got away from his father when that father starts bringing down that big knife? How does it say this here? It says he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. He would have had to have allowed Abraham to tie him. He could have easily run away from the old man, right? He went willingly. That's the message here, is that Isaac was willing to die. If that's what his father said needed to happen, he was willing to do it. Now, we get this picture of Abraham with the big knife coming down like this. But that's not the way sacrifices were done. They would cut the jugular. They'd cut it here and here and let them bleed out. It wasn't even like slitting the whole neck. They would just cut the jugular and let them bleed out. It was usually a very calm kind of thing. But you certainly, if you knew that was what was going to happen, you would not be so very calm, getting tied up and laid on the fire ready to be killed. That's what happened. Let's see. He bound his son Isaac, laid him on an altar on top of the second. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay him. But who? Have we talked about that person before? We talked about that person before, didn't we? The angel of the Lord called out from heaven, Abraham, Abram. And what's Abraham say? Here. Yes, here. Which is exactly what he said before in the beginning. I'm here. What? Do not lay hand on the boy, he said. Know that you do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. That's when Abraham then found the ram in the thicket. So we have a lot of alignment here with Christ. And I agree with this commentator's perspective, except for the last one. I have a little concern about the last one. So Abraham offers his only son as a sacrifice. God offers his only son as a sacrifice. Isaac is to be sacrificed in the region of Moriah. Christ is sacrificed in the region of Moriah. Isaac carries the wood of the fire for his own sacrifice. Christ carries the wood of the cross for his own sacrifice. Abraham is told God will provide the lamb for the sacrificial offering. God provides Christ, the Lamb of God, for the sacrificial offering. And Isaac is about 33 years old when Abraham offers him as a sacrifice. Christ is about 33 years old when God offers him as a sacrifice. I don't know how old Isaac was. Because like you said, the evidence we have was he was older than being weaned, and he had to be younger than 37 because his mother dies at 37 in the next chapter. So somewhere in between. So this commentator feels that 33 would be right, and I think he's backward aligning, like saying, well, Christ was 33, so he must have been 33. But I don't say that's not true. I'm just saying we don't really know that from what we have in Scripture. So God requires that we bring the best of what we have to him. The best of whatever it is we have, we're supposed to bring to him. We're not supposed to leave anything from him. And he is not like other gods. He is different than other gods. And that's the part that would have gotten me if I was Abraham. It would have been hard for me to be faithful because I would have thought I imagined it or something. So it's interesting how well Abraham's passed the test. Maybe it helped that he had spoken with God 6 times before, and this was the 7th time he had spoken or heard from God. I don't know. But this chapter 22 is different than the rest of the chapters. In verse 22, we left off. Let's look at verse 20. Sometime later, Abraham was told, Milcah is also a mother. She has borne sons to your brother Nahor. So he's letting him know that his brother Nahor has sons. Uz, the firstborn, Buz, his brother. Now that's wise. Uz and his brother Buz. and then Kemuel, the father of Aram. Kesed, Hazel, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. Michael bore these 8 sons to Abraham's brothers. Nahor, his concubine, whose name was Remuah, also had sons, Teba, Gema, Tahash, and Makkah. And I don't know if that's how those are pronounced, but that's just how I read them. So if I have to read them, I get to choose how I pronounce them. So now we have chapter 23. Now we see a whole different it's back to the before. I really feel like chapter 22 is why Abraham was called by God a prophet. That it set up this concept of Christ that we're going to see talked about in Hebrews and James and Galatians and Colossians. It set up this understanding of the Messiah and what would happen for the generations to come. But look at 23. We're back to the culture of that day.
Yeah.
Sarah lived to be 127 years old. So how old was she when she had Isaac?
90?
90?
Yeah.
So she lives another 30 years, 30, almost 40 years after that. 10, 30, some, 40 years almost. No, 30 years. Be 30 years. 37, well, almost 40. Almost 40, yeah. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So where's Hebron? Show you. Remember when the tree of Mamre or whatever, the Mamre area was right here, and Hebron was here, and this is where those three messengers came to tell Abraham about Lot, and he could see Sodom and Gomorrah here. Right after that, he went out into the desert and ended up in Beersheba, and now they're in Hebron to bury Sarah. Okay. She died in Hebron in the land of Canaan. Abram went to mourn for Sarah and weep over her. Then Abraham rose from his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am an alien and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury the dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead. No way is Abraham going to do that. That's all a ruse right there. Because what's going to happen if he buries his dead in the land that he does not own? Now they own the land of his dead. So then if something happens in the future, they withhold him access to the tomb, right? So there's this whole political thing going on here. This is a big, like they're acting, we don't have this in our culture, but they still do this in the Mideast, in that culture. So they're like saying, oh, no, please take this place. And they're going to stab him in the back. So it's kind of a conniving kind of thing. But it looks very gracious on the front side. Verse 7, Then Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land. Bowed down to them, the Hittites. He said to them, If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf. So he will sell the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you. Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of his city. No, my lord, he said, listen to me. I give you the field. I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead. Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in their hearing, Listen to me if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, Listen to me, my lord. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. Ah, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. You hear the negotiating? Abraham agreed to Ephraim's terms and weighed out for him the price he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So Ephraim's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it and all the trees within the borders of the field, was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which is at Hebron in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave in it were deeded to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. And so Abraham, being very wise to not give in to, to stay with the negotiation of that, own that land. But in the end, the people who came after him ended up fighting over that land, and this is now the cave. It's called the Cave of the Patriarchs. Of course, it did not look like that when Abraham buried Sarah there. It was a cave at the end of a field. But you can see over time it's become quite a place. And I believe Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, and Sarah are supposed to be buried there. Now, why do you think that site would be one of the most contested sites in the Palestinians' land? Why do you think it would be so contested among the different groups? Because you've got Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, and Sarah there. So Ishmael and Isaac's father and stepmother, and Isaac would be the brother, and Isaac's wife, Rebekah, are all there.
So they won't bomb that place.
Everybody fights over it. They're all fighting over it. Everybody wants to own it, control it, be the one that get it. And in that culture, we have that here today, but not as much as we used to. But there in the Mideast, they still have that. If I got into a fight, if our grandfathers got into a fight, then we don't like each other because our grandfathers got into a fight. Yeah, just like that. That kind of thinking. We don't see that as much today as we used to, but that's what happens there. So that's the history. That's the cave of the patriarchs.
How big a piece of land was it?
I don't know. I didn't see that anywhere in my readings. I don't know.
How much silver was that worth?
400 shekels. I don't know if it says
Laura,
here.
is that in Palestine?
Yes.
400 shekels is about 10 pounds or 4.6 kilograms. in weight.
Says it was an exorbitant price for a field, and Ephron was taking advantage of Abraham during a time of grief and bereavement. He knew that Abraham had to deal quickly. I can't. It doesn't say anything on here for me on mine. So. Okay, so Abraham now is established as a prophet. You can see that he left a prophetic message for the future generations. And where's Ishmael? Last week I mentioned that Ishmael just seems to disappear, but I was corrected because he shows up for the funeral apparently. I don't know, when we get there we'll see. They're still in the same land where Ishmael is at, so it's not unlikely that they had some connection or some still, but we don't see anything about him. I heard that he's in the at the end when Abraham dies, but I haven't seen it yet. Okay.